In 2016, after a year of practicing my paddling techniques on short outings, I decided to go out on my first real packrafting adventure. I chose to do the Bob White Loop, so called because it's all inside the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana, and the return leg of the loop follows the White River. Most of the actual floating is on the South Fork of the Flathead River, which runs from south to north through the middle of the wilderness, about as far as you can get from any road in the lower 48 states. This seemed like a good beginner-level trip with moderate distances, both hiking and floating. I expected the rafting to be exciting, but really wasn't prepared to be surrounded by wolves or to be chased by a bull moose. All in all, this trip would turn out to be one of the best ever. To give you some context, here's the state of Montana with Missoula and Kalispell and Great Falls here. And this is Glacier National Park, and just across the road, Highway 2 from Glacier Park, this is the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. And I will drive to Augusta and then along this 35 miles of dirt road back into Benchmark. The hiking part to the Bob White Loop begins at Benchmark, better known as the #1 entry point for outfitters taking tourists in to see the Chinese Wall, which is probably the best known natural feature in the Bob Marshall and part of the Continental Divide Trail. In this case, though, after less than half a mile of hiking, I will cross the South Fork of the Sun River and turn south, thus leaving the main stream of traffic heading north. This is still part of the CDT, though, for 3.4 miles, until turning off here to go up Hoadley Creek and over Stadler Pass, one of the lowest passes over the Continental Divide and a relatively quick way to get into the heart of the Bob. The plan is to spend the first night in this area, known simply as the Basin, then on the morning of the second day put in on Danaher Creek somewhere here. Float down Danaher until it joins with Youngs Creek to become the South Fork of the Flathead. On past Big Prairie and take out here at the White River Park. Over the South Fork of the White River, over White River Pass, and down to Indian Point. After that, we have the option to put back in and float about 5 miles back to this Peck Bridge, where we take out and hike the 5 miles back to Benchmark. The first day's hike over Stadler Pass, with an elevation gain and loss of right about 2,000 feet, is pleasant but not especially scenic. Until you get to the awe-inspiring vastness of the Basin, an open meadow miles wide surrounded by ancient ponderosa pines. I set up camp on the far edge and, after nearly 17 miles with a 41-pound pack, settled in for a peaceful night's sleep. But that was not to happen. About 2 miles later, I arrived at the place to put in on Danaher Creek. At a glance, I could see that the water level was too low. On the morning I left home, the gauge at Twin Creeks read 2,180 CFS. I had read that Danaher really needed to be above 3,000 to float it, but figured I would try it anyway. Now I would come to regret that decision. Between the sweepers and occasional massive log jams, it probably would have been quicker just to hike the 4 miles to the confluence with Youngs Creek. That log was too low to go under with me in the boat, but I figured I could just walk under waiting behind the boat. Unfortunately, the water got too deep for that, so I had to portage. Once I hit the actual South Fork, things got a lot better. There were still some tricky obstacles to traverse, though.
Probably could have made it.
Have fun!
But there's one kind favor you can do for me. There's one kind favor you can do for me. There's one kind favor you can do for me. Just see that my grave is kept clean. Hey. And that's two wild horses following me. See, that's two wild horses following me. And that's two wild horses following me. Waiting on my buried ground. Hey! Have you ever heard a confluence sound?
I took out at Big Prairie just to have a look around. Big Prairie is one of the largest and most active of the backcountry forest service stations, helping to manage the Bob Marshall. The setting is magnificent, and the cabins are just beautiful. Imagine how cool it would be to spend the entire summer here. The Pack Bridge at Big Prairie is one of just 2 bridges that span the South Fork in the wilderness section. I didn't want to just splice together the splashy parts of this trip and give a false impression of what floating the South Fork is like. Much of it is quite sedate, allowing plenty of opportunity to look around. Packrafting is pretty comfortable generally, but I do need to stop about every hour, take a break, and stretch my legs. That also gives me a chance to really soak in the surroundings and appreciate the little details, like how amazingly clear this water is and the beauty of the river rocks.
Wish it was easy every day. I'd like that better. Wish you'd forgotten what to say.
Things got a little more exciting in the burnt part section, about an hour downstream from Big Prairie. Nothing above Class 2 though, just good clean fun. After 7 hours on the river, floating 19 miles, I arrived at the takeout just above the White River confluence. Travel after Big Prairie was much faster, and I covered 8 miles in just 2 hours. I ate dinner by the river while everything dried out in the evening sun. Then hiked about a mile and camped in the middle of the White River Park, having traveled 23 miles total that day. I've read that Native Americans used to start forest fires deliberately for thousands of years in order for the underbrush to be swept away, and this was so effective that the first white pioneers were often able to drive their wagons through the forests that were cleared like that. I believe that the White River Park is one of the few places in the country today to experience what that may have been like. I started up the White River Valley, but didn't get very far before I noticed this guy following me up the trail. I got well off the trail and waited for him to pass by, but he was far more interested in finding out what I was.
Hey Moose. It's okay. What you gonna do?
With the paddle sticking up from the pack, perhaps I looked like some deformed potential rival. He wasn't threatening, just very curious. Eventually it occurred to me that I really didn't want a bull moose ahead of me on the trail, with the chance of running into him around every corner. So I got back on the road and hiked as fast as I could without actually running. The goal was to get just enough of a lead that he lost interest. I knew I wasn't about to actually outrun him. And he demonstrated how easily he could keep up by tracking me for almost 2 hours. Every time I looked back, there he still was. He finally did get bored and allowed me to carry on. However, by that time I had used up most of my reserves, so climbing the 3,000 feet up and over White River Pass really kicked my butt. The view made up for it though.
Get along, little doggy, get along with me. Ooh, it's time you face the fact that you can't remember the in-between. so a bigger part of my time. Never asking why, I'm always in a million pieces, and I don't want to admit it's always what I get, and I don't wanna take the blame, but it's my fault.
Made it down to Indian Point Cabin and stopped for dinner on the porch. Then hiked another mile for a total of 19 miles that day and found a great campsite for the night. On the morning of the last day, it was clear that the water in the West Fork was too low for floating. So after my experience on Danaher Creek, I was happy to just hike out the last 10 miles. After the pack bridge, there is a wonderful bench area above the river for about a mile, and then it's just an ugly, burned-out 4-mile trudge back to the trailhead. So, rather than show that, I'll leave you with a little more time on the river.
Get along, little doggy, get along.